The world has spent millions in advancing the field of medicine. But what if I told you that by millions, I don't mean dollars, I mean people? You see, modern medicine is extraordinary. It not only helps us survive longer, but also thrive for longer. But there is a dark history behind medicine that most people don't know. And those who do know try to cover it up. It began with good intention, but led to countless bodies being ripped from their graves, and even led to outright murder. This is the true cost of modern medicine and the history of body snatching. But to truly understand how we got there, we need to go back not 20 years, not 50, not even 100 years. We need to go back 2,300 years to ancient Greece. Chapter 1: The Father of Anatomy. In the year 335 BC, Greece was undergoing significant political and economic changes. Its education system was heavily influenced by Stoicism and Platonism, philosophies that emphasized wisdom and mentorship. Medical students were no exception. They sought guidance from respected teachers, and one of the most renowned of them was Herophilus. Little is known about the early years of Herophilus' life. However, what we do know is that he spent his childhood in Greece, and then he eventually moved to the Egyptian city of Alexandria to begin his medical training under the guidance of the physician named Praxagoras of Kos. At the time, Alexandria was home to the largest library in the world. Historical records estimate that it housed around 700,000 scrolls. Because of this, the city became a hotbed for philosophers, scientists, and the world's finest medical practitioners. Here, Herophilus would go on to become a celebrated physician with an unparalleled understanding of the human body. But how did he achieve this distinction? Well, at the time, most physicians studied anatomy through vivisection, which is the dissecting of animals to learn about bodily functions. Herophilus, however, had a different approach, one that could have landed him in prison or even cost him his life. You see, the Greeks, guided by Platonic teachings, believed that the soul was imprisoned in the body after death. They held the human body sacred, and tampering with it, especially opening it after death, was considered a violation that could release the soul into the void. Despite these beliefs, Herophilus saw the limitation of studying only the outside of the human body. So to truly understand anatomy, he began dissecting human bodies in secret. Fortunately for Herophilus, Greece was under the rule of the Ptolemaic dynasty at the time, which encouraged scientific inquiry. With the support and funding of Roman patrons, Herophilus continued his groundbreaking work. But he had to remain cautious, as a shift in the political landscape would bring his research and even his life to a swift and fatal end. As time went on, Herophilus' work became instrumental in advancing the understanding of the human body. His groundbreaking discoveries not only gained the support of the elite, but also led to the normalization of body dissection in society. So much so, in fact, that Herophilus began conducting live dissections to train other physicians and even allow members of the public who were interested to observe. Through years of secret dissections, Herophilus made monumental advancements in the medical science. He proved that the brain, not the heart, was the seat of intelligence, identified specific muscles and nerves, and described the membranes surrounding the brain and spinal cord. While no records survived detailing how he obtained the bodies for his studies, historians believe they likely came from condemned prisoners and the unclaimed corpses of the poor. Due to the constant supply of bodies and the severe punishments associated with grave desecration, it is believed that Herophilus himself did not engage in body snatching. However, it is clear that his work in dissection and his fascination with the human body would lay the foundation for body snatching in the future. But that would come later, much, much later. Chapter 2: The Dark Ages. Contrary to what you might expect, Herophilus' work didn't immediately spark widespread interest in dissection. Instead, body dissection was only practiced for about 30 to 40 years. After his death, it would be nearly 1,600 years before dissection was used as a standard practice again. Although Roman Emperor Frederick II permitted dissection once every 5 years, the time and volume restrictions made it difficult for dissection to become a regular practice in the medical field. Dissection became even more challenging in 1299 when Pope Boniface VIII enacted the De Sepulturis decree, which banned the manipulation of corpses. Despite many restrictions, those most interested in anatomy and advancing medical science continued to dissect bodies in secret. For example, in 1506, when the famous inventor Leonardo da Vinci was at the peak of his career, he witnessed an old man die. Curious about the body and unwilling to let such a rare opportunity go to waste, Leonardo dissected the man to see what lay beneath the skin. By this point, he had only dissected animals, including dogs, horses, and a few birds, and even a bear, but he had never worked on a human corpse. Over the next 7 years, Leonardo went on to dissect 29 more bodies. However, in 1511, one of Leonardo's closest friends, who was equally fascinated with anatomy, died of the plague. The tragedy led Leonardo to put down his scalpel, never to dissect another human body again. Fortunately, Leonardo's drawings and sketches of the human body were kept in secret until later researchers uncovered and translated them. Through his clandestine dissections, Leonardo gained an incredible understanding of human anatomy for his time. He was able to discover and recognize that the heart, not the liver, was the core of the blood circulation system. He also described the coronary sinuses over 200 years before they were officially recognized. Whether through luck or divine intervention, it was during this time that another man was born, one that would rival even Herophilus in success. His name was Andreas van Wesel, and he was born on December 31st in 1514 in the city of Brussels. During this period, it was customary to follow in the footsteps of your father, and for Andreas that meant pursuing a career in medicine. His father was a pharmacist and his grandfather had been a physician who served the Holy Roman Emperor. With his head start in medicine, Andreas eventually went on to study at the University of Paris, which at the time was part of the humanistic intellectual movement. This movement involved translating ancient texts into modern languages, and during this time, an Italian book from 1270, Introduction to Anatomy, was translated into French. This book introduced the concept of dissection to Andreas. Eventually, the war between France and the Roman Emperor forced Andreas to flee Paris and head to Italy. There he began training at the University of Padua, an institution renowned for its long-standing tradition of using dissection as a form of medical education. Andreas pursued medicine with dedication, and in 1543, he became a professor of anatomy and surgery. With his newfound position and the academic freedom offered by Padua, Andreas was able to dissect as many bodies as he deemed necessary. This freedom allowed him to produce remarkably accurate illustrations of various organs, such as the liver, which became foundational to modern medicine. These contributions earned him the title Father of Anatomy. Not long after, Andreas left Italy for Switzerland, where he continued his work, famously constructing the first complete human skeleton from the remains of an executed criminal. From Switzerland, he traveled and worked in several other countries, including Spain and France, each experience further deepening his understanding of anatomy and solidifying his legacy. However, not everyone shared Andreas's enthusiasm for dissection. After his death in 1564, the practice fell out of favor for a time, and it would take many years before dissection became a widespread tool in medical education once again. Between the 15th and 17th century, there were several instances where dissection was allowed in specific cases, only to be banned again. However, due to the monumental discoveries and advances made when dissection was permitted, religious and political views began to relax. This shift led to the passing of the Murder Act in England in 1752, which allowed the dissection of criminals sentenced to death. This served two purposes. First, it allowed dissection to continue without enraging the public, as people were believed to care less about the bodies of convicted criminals. Second, it acted as a deterrent to crime, as many at the time believed that to reach heaven, one's body had to remain intact. Medical advancement exploded almost immediately, but there was a problem. There weren't enough bodies. In response, the government expanded the number of crimes punishable by death in the hopes of producing more bodies for dissection. In fact, the number of crimes punishable by death grew to over 200 in just a few years. But even that wasn't enough. Physicians needed more bodies, so they began offering large sums of money to anyone who could provide them with one. This led to an act that many considered even more disturbing than dissection itself: body snatching. Chapter 3: The birth of body snatching. The growing demand for bodies to dissect wasn't exclusive to England. It was a problem faced across much of Europe. As a result, many European countries passed laws that allowed for the dissection of not only criminals, but also unclaimed bodies of prisoners, hospital patients, and poor citizens. These laws provided a steady supply of bodies for physicians in Europe. However, these laws were not put in place in England. At the same time, grave robbing had become a common practice among criminals. It involved digging up recently buried bodies from cemeteries, stripping them of any valuables like gold, jewelry, and anything else that could be sold. The grave robbers would then take everything they found and sell it for money, but they would leave the body behind. However, as the demand for bodies to dissect grew and the physicians began offering substantial sums of money for bodies, grave robbers began to take the bodies as well. Over time, the public became more and more aware of what was happening and started referring to these criminals not just as grave robbers, but as body snatchers. Physicians, on the other hand, referred to them by a different name: resurrectionists. But what drove so many men to engage in such a horrific practice? Surely the money couldn't have been that good, right? Wrong. At the time, the average person in England earned around £31.67 a year for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week of work. Meanwhile, a physician would pay £10 for a body in the winter and $7 for one in the summer. The higher price in the winter was due to the cold temperatures, which made it easier to store and preserve the bodies. That meant the average English person could earn 4 months' salary for a single body. At the time, the prevailing belief was that in order to go to heaven, your body had to remain intact. As a result, the public became increasingly concerned that their loved ones would be dug up and sold for dissection. Many wealthy individuals and families went to great lengths to protect the graves of their loved ones, hiring bodyguards to watch over them until the body had decomposed. This could take as long as a year. Wealthy families would also install metal gates and build concrete barriers around the graves to deter body snatchers. In fact, if you visit William Shakespeare's gravestone, you would find the words,
"Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust-enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones."
This inscription shows that even a great man like Shakespeare was concerned about the desecration of his remains. Poorer families, of course, couldn't afford the same measures as the wealthy, so they resorted to installing makeshift booby traps around the graves to deter the body snatchers. One common trap involved attaching gunpowder explosives to a tripwire, which would detonate if anyone attempted to disturb the grave. However, this was often insufficient. As body snatching became more lucrative, the body snatchers grew more skilled and resourceful. From this point on, demand and therefore supply of bodies only continued to grow. Chapter 4: The Rise of Body Snatching. In the beginning, body snatching was carried out by the poor as a desperate and quick way to earn money. However, as the demand for bodies increased, and with it the money offered, more skilled body snatchers began to emerge. Between 1802 and 1852, there were as many as 200 body snatching groups operating in London alone. These professionals often organized themselves into small groups of 2 to 4 people. They would bribe local funeral directors to inform them of upcoming funerals. Newly buried graves were the primary targets since they were easier to dig up, and the bodies were fresher, fetching a higher price. The most skilled body snatchers, however, preferred to act before the burial even took place. To do this, they would hire young, attractive women to visit hospitals and pose as relatives of someone who had recently died. The women would claim the body, insisting on burying it themselves with their family. Once the body was handed over, it would go straight to the body snatchers, and the woman would pocket a generous fee. This method was much cleaner and required far less time and effort. However, if they didn't intercept the body in time, they resorted to breaking into funeral homes and replacing the body in the coffin with weights. If all else failed, they would resort to digging up graves, a process requiring precise techniques to extract the body efficiently. First, they would begin digging directly down to where the head of the body lay, then break a hole in the coffin, tie a noose around the body's neck, and pull it out through the hole using a rope. Alternatively, body snatchers used a different technique. In this method, they would dig a hole behind the top end of the coffin until they were in line with it. Then they would dig sideways toward the top of the coffin, break it open, and pull the body through the tunnel they had made, lifting it up through the hole. Those who used this technique often would dig the hole 5 to 6 meters away, making it harder to detect that someone had dug down and stolen the body. Regardless of the method, body snatchers worked quickly, often in as little as 15 minutes. Once the body was removed, the body snatcher would strip off the clothing and jewelry, tossing it back into the coffin. This was done because the penalties for grave robbing, stealing valuables from the dead, were extremely severe. However, the punishments for body snatching were much more lenient. In fact, there were very few laws, if any, that prohibited the snatching of bodies at all. After the body was taken, it would either be sold to a physician at a nearby hospital or stuffed into a barrel, often used for whiskey or sawdust, and transported to the hospital. You might be thinking, didn't the doctors and nurses wonder where the bodies were coming from? The answer is complicated. During this time, the value placed on human life wasn't what it is today, especially when it came to poorer citizens. When body snatching first became widespread, grave robbers often targeted cemeteries in poorer neighborhoods. In America, this frequently meant African American cemeteries. During the 1780s, around 15% of the US population was black, most of whom were enslaved. Yet reports from the early 1800s indicate that over 80% of the bodies dissected at Kentucky universities were African American. In Kentucky, where the slave trade was thriving, the availability of bodies for dissection was so abundant that institutions like Medical College of South Carolina were established to capitalize on this grim supply. But dead bodies wasn't enough. This is why there are also reports of live dissections being performed on black slaves, which experts agree contributed to the complete dehumanization of the black Americans during this period. The most infamous example of this is the case of Henrietta Lacks, a woman whose cancer cells were extracted from her body without consent and used for medical research. The body snatching of black Americans became so prevalent that those who engaged in it earned a new name, night doctors. But it wasn't just body snatchers perpetrating these horrors. Slave owners would often sell the bodies of deceased slaves, and in some cases, hospitals went as far as blatantly kidnapping and killing black children to obtain more bodies. These perpetrators were known as the Black Bottle Men, a name derived from the method of killing, which involved giving the children a black bottle filled with poison. However, they also went by the name Needlemen. This dark history discussed in the book The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, where the author recounts stories from this time period. One particularly chilling quote comes from a woman recalling her childhood.
You'd be surprised how many people disappeared in East Baltimore when I was a girl. I'm telling you, I lived here in the 50s when they got Henrietta, and we weren't allowed to go anywhere near Hopkins. When it got dark and when we were young, we had to be on the steps or Hopkins might get us.
Unlike the black bottle men, who used poison concealed in a bottle, the needle men employed a different method. They would inject both adults and children with a poisoned needle, typically in the back of the arm. Shortly after being pricked, the victim would die, and their body would be sold to a nearby physician or hospital. Another quote from the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks reads,
I sure don't go out much at this time of year. You take a chance just walking on the streets. Them needlemen's is everywhere. You see, them needlemen's is medical students from the charity hospital trying to get your body to work on.
There are many more stories from this time period, each shedding light on the horrifying reality of body snatching and the murder of innocent African Americans. But that's a story for another time. So make sure to click subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for more. Jewish cemeteries were also frequent targets due to Jewish customs, which require a body to be buried within 24 hours of death. This quick burial made them an ideal source for doctors seeking fresh bodies to examine. Many doctors and nurses therefore simply turned a blind eye to the situation. After all, as long as they were getting the bodies they needed, they could satisfy their curiosity and advance their medical knowledge. The same couldn't be said for the public, however, because as body snatching became more efficient and protective measures failed, the public's fear transformed into outrage as their loved ones' bodies began to disappear. In Dublin, in 1828, a group of body snatchers was going about their business when a group of locals, mourning the loss of a loved one, confronted them to scare them off. Later that day, the body snatchers returned, but this time they brought more men with them. So what did the mourners do in retaliation? They gathered more men as well. What followed was a violent and bloody showdown, with both groups opening fire on one another. According to one of the men who was there was a volley of bullets, slugs, and swan shots from the resurrectionists, which prompted a discharge of firearms from the defenders. It was chaos. Amid gunfire, an even more chaotic scene unfolded. Many of the combatants without guns resorted to attacking each other with pickaxes, but such is often the nature of battle. The side with more to lose tends to prevail. Through grit and determination, the group of mourners continued to fight the body snatchers, ultimately driving them off. A few years later, one body snatcher was shot in the middle of an attempted theft, and 3 others were arrested. Slowly but surely, the public began to fight back against the body snatchers. However, the tension between the public and body snatchers in Dublin were nothing compared to what would unfold in the United States, where body snatching sparked one of the biggest rivalries in American history. Chapter 5: The Resurrection Riot. It was 1788. Dissection and body snatching were common practices around the world, but nowhere were they more prominent than in New York. America was still under English rule and had similar laws in place regarding dissection. A group of young boys had heard rumors about physicians who were dissecting bodies to study what was inside them. As boys do, they hatched a plan to sneak into a hospital to see the body for themselves. But when they arrived, the physician was still there. Fortunately for them, he was already in the middle of dissecting a woman's body. The surgeon, focused on his work, eventually noticed the group of boys watching him. In what many believe was an attempt to play a prank on the kids, he pulled the dissected arm off the woman's body and waved it at them, shouting,
"This is your mother's arm. I just dug it up,"
before laughing and returning to his work. Horrified, the group of boys ran away, laughing and screaming as they recounted the event. However, one of the boys wasn't laughing. He had recently lost his mother and was filled with a deep, twisted sense of dread. What if that truly was his mother's arm? Later that day, the boy went to his father and told him what had happened. In response, the father grabbed a shovel and went straight to his wife's grave. He was confident his wife would still be there, but he wasn't going to take any chances. To his horror, however, he found exactly what he feared. The body was gone. Furious and sickened by the body snatching that had been taking place with no consequence, the man gathered a group of locals who were also fed up with what was happening. His plan was to march to the New York hospital and demand retribution. Word spread quickly, and soon a crowd of 5,000 strong had gathered behind the man, intent of seeking justice. In their pursuit of vengeance, the group brutally injured as many doctors and nurses as they could find, with 6 doctors losing their lives in the chaos. In response to the violence, the government acted swiftly to pass a state that heavily penalized anyone who took part in body snatching. Anyone caught would be fined, whipped, or put in prison. Following this, other states of America adopted similar laws to help regulate and legitimize the practice. However, while America quickly took action to address the body snatching issue, England took much longer to find a solution. This delay allowed for the rise of organized crime groups like the London Borough Gang. But even worse, the delay in addressing the body snatching issue in England allowed for what would later become known as the Westport Murders. Chapter 6: The Westport Murders. Between 1827 and 1828, body snatching reached an all-time high in Scotland. This created 2 major issues. First, there were fewer and fewer bodies available to be stolen, and second, more people were taking measures to protect their loved ones' bodies from being snatched. Some used concrete, while others relied on large metal cages known as mort safes. These factors created a supply and demand problem, causing physicians to pay even higher prices for bodies. Around this time, 2 men, Burke and Hare, were running a boarding house in Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland. One day, they discovered that one of their customers had died. Unsure of what to do with the body, one of them suggested selling it to a nearby physician, Dr. Knox. Dr. Knox happily paid them £7, and the men left, thrilled with their unexpected windfall. Little did they know, the discussion would mark the beginning of something much darker. 2 months later, another customer at the inn became gravely ill. Worried that the woman might spread rumors about getting sick in the boarding house, Burke and Hare took drastic measures to protect their business. They killed her. Realizing they needed to hide the body, they once again sold it to Dr. Knox, who paid them £7 once more. From that point on, Burke and Hare transitioned from opportunists who simply sold a body from someone who had died naturally to cold-blooded murderers who exploited their customers' trust. Over the next 10 months, they would kill 15 more people, selling each body to Dr. Knox. Rather than digging up graves, Burke and Hare resorted to murder. They targeted vulnerable individuals, often elderly or homeless, luring them into the boarding house before suffocating them to obtain fresh bodies for medical schools. These murders were cold, calculated, and committed purely to satisfy the growing demand for bodies. Eventually, the police caught wind that Hare might know something about the murders, so they offered him a plea deal. If he confessed and provided evidence against Burke, he would be granted immunity. Soon after, Hare gave detailed testimony that led to Burke's arrest. During the trial, the judge stated,
"Your body should be publicly dissected and anatomized, and I trust that, if it ever becomes customary to preserve skeletons, yours will be preserved, so that posterity may keep in remembrance of your atrocious crimes."
As a result, Burke was sentenced to death on Christmas Day, 1828, and hanged just a few weeks later. His body was then used for dissection and displayed in the Anatomical Museum of Edinburgh's Medical School. It was here that England finally decided to put an end to the body snatching problem once and for all. Shortly after the horrific crimes, the House of Commons responded to the public outcry and began investigating the body snatching issue. In 1832, 4 years after Burke was hanged, the Anatomy Act was finally enacted. This law made it clear that if a body from a workhouse, hospital, or prison went unclaimed for 48 hours after death, it was legal for a representative of the body to donate it for medical study. However, the United Kingdom wasn't the only place where such terrible crimes occurred in the pursuit of fresh bodies. Similar cases were reported in American cities like Cincinnati, Ohio, Baltimore, and even across Maryland. However, the history of body snatching is as wide as it is long. While England and America were facing shortages in bodies for their medical studies, countries like Germany faced the opposite problem. They had too many bodies. Chapter 7: The Experiments. Between 1933 and 1945, the National Socialist regime supplied its physicians with tens of thousands of bodies from Polish and Jewish prisoners of war they were executing. In fact, in 1942, a specific piece of legislation was passed allowing for the bodies of Polish and Jewish prisoners to be dissected and examined with no repercussions. However, in Germany, body snatching took a darker turn. It shifted from stealing the dead to abducting the living. During World War II, over 40 different types of experiments were conducted by doctors in the name of advancing medical knowledge. Unlike those in other countries who focused on dissecting and studying the bodies of the deceased, these German doctors performed their dissections and inspections on live patients, subjecting them to unimaginable horrors. In 1942, German military leaders sought ways to save pilots forced to eject at high altitudes. To achieve this, military officials and physicians conducted experiments on prisoners by placing them in low-pressure chambers that mimicked the altitudes of 68,000 feet or 20.7 kilometers. Doctors observed as the prisoners succumbed to the extreme conditions and died. Afterward, the doctors dissected the bodies and studied their brains to further their medical understanding. Of the 200 people subjected to these tests, 80 died during the experiments, while the remaining 120 were executed shortly afterward. This was just one of many atrocities inflicted on prisoners of war during this time. Other experiments included forcing prisoners to drink seawater, injecting them with poisons, and countless other inhumane tests. This chapter in history is arguably one of the darkest examples of body snatching. Yet, as horrific as these events were, they tragically contributed to some of the most significant medical advancements in history. Chapter 8: Heavy Price. As horrific as this period of history is, it led to some of the most significant medical advancements ever made. This has sparked intense debate among modern scholars and historians about the ethics of dissection and body snatching. On one hand, thousands, if not tens of thousands, died in the pursuit of medical progress. On the other hand, countless lives have been saved because of what was discovered. Fortunately, modern legal systems have since found solutions to address these ethical dilemmas. In the late 20th century, organizations like UAGA in the United States began promoting the idea of donating your body after death for the advancement of medical science. As a result, countries like the US now receive more than enough bodies for examination through donation programs, eliminating the need for body snatching and murder. The UK also amended the Anatomy Act in 1984, further promoting and legalizing body donation for science. Since then, various other acts and laws, like the Coroner's Act of 1988, have been introduced to further regulate the use of bodies for dissection in the name of science. The most notable is, of course, England's Human Tissue Act of 2004. As a result of these events, the Human Tissue Authority was established to regulate and oversee the use of human bodies in medical science. This act reinforced the importance of personal consent, making it clearer than ever that explicit permission must be given before any dissection or examination can take place. In fact, this act and others that preceded it laid the foundation for modern practices in many Western countries, such as asking individuals if they wish to be identified as organ donors on their driver's licenses. It ensures that even after death, no one can take your organs or use your body for purposes you never agreed to. Because of these changes, Human dissection has become one of the primary ways doctors and surgeons teach students around the world, allowing doctors and surgeons to undergo more extensive training before working with real bodies, further decreasing the demand for bodies. Nowadays, body snatching is a thing of the past for the public. However, for doctors, it serves as a lasting reminder of how the pursuit of good intentions can quickly spiral into acts of evil. This is one reason why doctors take the Hippocratic Oath, pledging to do no harm. The oath helps to ensure that the desire to help many never comes at the expense of harming a few. Dr. Barry Marshall is one of the most famous doctors in history, but he wasn't always. In 1982, Dr. Barry Marshall believed he had discovered the cause of stomach ulcers. But the medical world laughed at him, ridiculed his findings, and dismissed him as an extremist fool. But Barry wasn't willing to back down, so with grim determination, he did the unthinkable. He drank a petri dish of deadly bacteria. But why would he do something so extreme? Well, to understand that, we need to go back to the beginning. Chapter 1: Humble Beginnings. As Barry would go on to live a unique life, it is only fitting that he began in a place with an equally unique name, Kalgoorlie, a small city in Western Australia. He was born on September the 30th, 1951. Both his mother and father worked tirelessly to give Barry and his 4 brothers a good life, but it wasn't easy. Their house often had tin roofs and dirt floors. Despite these humble beginnings, Barry always had something that kept him going. You see, from an early age, he was constantly exposed to stories of medicine from his mother. As a nurse, she would come home each day and share what she'd seen, the good, the bad, and of course, the ugly. While Barry's 3 younger brothers would squirm at her stories, he only grew more fascinated by the world of medicine. After graduating from high school, this passion led Barry to the University of Western Australia's School of Medicine. With his mother's support and his own hard work, Barry graduated in 1974 with a Bachelor of Medicine and a Bachelor of Surgery. At just 23 years old, Barry had the world at his fingertips. Many described him as a smart, promising young man with a bright future, but few at the time realized just how bright his future would be. Chapter 2: A Chance Meeting. Following his graduation, Barry went on to live a typical suburban life. He got married, had kids, and focused on his studies and career. This dedication and hard work led him to a position at the Royal Perth Hospital, where he was eventually appointed as the head registrar of medicine. An impressive achievement for someone so young. This was a significant turning point in Barry's career, but it paled in comparison to an even greater moment. Meeting Dr. Robin Warren in 1981. Dr. Warren, a pathologist at the hospital, was incredibly passionate about gastritis, a condition described as the inflammation of the stomach lining, which left untreated can lead to more severe complications like bleeding, stomach ulcers, and cancer. At the time, doctors weren't sure what caused gastritis, but there were 2 key factors that shaped their understanding. First, they commonly found ulcers in men who led stressful lives and smoked heavily. Second, they observed an increase in stomach problems like gastritis when rats were placed in stressful environments, such as being submerged in cold water while wearing straitjackets. The same doctors also discovered that administering anti-acid could reduce the ulcers. When you're stressed, your stomach produces more acid. Anti-acids help reduce the excess acid, so doctors naturally assumed that stress was the main cause of gastritis and more severe conditions like stomach ulcers and cancer. Because of this presumption, doctors at the time believed that gastritis was the result of stress, and so when tests couldn't identify a clear issue, patients were sent home with a prescription for antidepressants. However, despite this treatment, many patients' conditions worsened from simple gastritis to more serious problems like ulcers or tumors. In these cases, doctors would send patients to Dr. Warren to make sure they didn't have cancer. It was during these tests that Dr. Warren began to notice something strange, which was the presence of bacteria called Helicobacter pylori on the inner lining of the stomach. This discovery led to a theory that would eventually change the foundation of medicine. However, Dr. Warren knew he couldn't pursue this theory on his own. He needed help. In 1981, Dr. Warren was introduced to Barry. At the time, Barry was in his fellowship training, which is the stage of training a doctor goes through when specializing in a specific field of medicine. Barry was asked to assist Dr. Warren with this project, and for the rest of 1981 and well into 1982, the two worked together, analyzing the presence of Helicobacter pylori in the gut. Eventually, the two hypothesized that the true cause of gastritis wasn't stress. They believed stress wasn't even a factor. Instead, they proposed that the presence of Helicobacter pylori was the real cause of gastritis and stomach ulcers. However, when they tried to share their hypothesis with other doctors, they were often met with ridicule and labeled as extremists. In the minds of most doctors, it simply wasn't feasible that bacteria could be responsible for stomach ulcers, as they believed that bacteria couldn't thrive in the stomach due to its highly acidic environment. Fortunately, toward the end of 1982, the two men were granted funding to test their hypothesis. They breathed a sigh of relief, feeling that their struggle was finally over. Little did they know, this was just the beginning. Chapter 3: Desperate Times. To properly test their hypothesis, Dr. Warren and Barry began using throat swabs from patients with stomach ulcers to collect samples. They then sent these samples to the lab, where technicians would place them on a petri dish, a special type of dish that helps bacteria grow faster. The test was simple. If the bacteria grew, it meant an infection was present. If there was no growth, then the ulcer wasn't caused by the bacteria. Dr. Warren and Barry were confident that they would immediately see bacterial growth, but they didn't. In fact, for the first 30 patients, there was no sign of growth at all. The two men were dumbfounded. Had they missed something? Were they wrong all along? Were the doctors who had ridiculed them right? They spent days contemplating these questions, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Eventually, they decided to visit the technicians to see how the samples were being handled. After some questioning, the two men discovered that the technicians were discarding the swabs after only 2 days, a common practice for throat swabs when no bacteria growth is observed. But the bacteria they were testing, Helicobacter pylori, was slow growing. Fortunately, the 31st sample had not been discarded due to the heavy workload of the technicians. Instead of sitting for 2 days, it had been left from Thursday to Monday, a total of 5 days. When Dr. Warren and Barry checked the sample, they found exactly what they had been expecting: clear Helicobacter pylori growth. After many more tests and a year of analysis, the two submitted their findings to the Gastroenterological Society of Australia. To their shock, it was turned down. Dr. Warren was stunned. He couldn't believe the inconsistency of the doctors around him. It was at this point he considered giving up. But Barry wasn't ready to quit. He developed a plan, so bold and so foolproof that if it worked, it would make every doctor in the country, if not the world, stop and listen to them. His plan was simple. He would intentionally and voluntarily consume a petri dish filled with Helicobacter pylori bacteria. Chapter 4: Desperate Measures. You'd think Barry would have spoken to his wife before doing something so insane, but he didn't. Instead, he simply asked Dr. Warren to perform an endoscopy, a procedure where a flexible tube is inserted down a patient's throat to check for bacteria in the stomach. During the process, Dr. Warren paused and asked why Barry wanted this done. With a tube halfway down his throat and gritting his teeth, Barry simply replied, "Just take the biopsy." A few minutes later, Dr. Warren confirmed that there was no presence of Helicobacter pylori bacteria in his stomach. The two documented their findings, and then Barry did the unthinkable. He picked up the petri dish of meaty broth, swirled it around, and chugged it down as if he were a student drinking beer with his friends. Immediately, Barry's stomach began to gurgle, but for the most part, he felt fine. He assumed it would take at least 1 to 2 years for an infection to develop into an ulcer. He was wrong. After just 5 days, he started waking up every night, violently vomiting. His condition worsened, and by day 10, he decided to undergo another endoscopy. What he and Dr. Warren found was both surprising and unexpected. His stomach was overrun by millions of inflamed cells caused by Helicobacter pylori bacteria. The two exchanged a stunned look, realizing what they had just proved. Gastritis wasn't primarily caused by stress. It was instead primarily caused by bacteria, and it could infect healthy people as well. It was now that Barry decided to tell his wife. Naturally, she was outraged that he had done something so reckless without consulting her. She wasn't just worried about him, she feared that her children would also be at risk. However, after Barry explained everything, she eventually calmed down and asked what the next step was. On day 14, Barry underwent another endoscopy and began a course of antibiotics to fight the infection. Now all he could do was sit and wait to see if he had just made a monumental mistake or if he was on the verge of making history. Chapter 5: The Aftermath. The gastritis eventually went away, providing Barry and Dr. Warren with definite proof that gastritis was primarily caused by bacteria, not stress. The two had also proven that this condition, which had taken the lives of millions around the world, could be fixed with a simple cure: antibiotics. In response, the two men published a report on their findings in 1985. You would think that the medical community would have taken notice immediately, or perhaps the next year, or the year after that, but they didn't. In fact, the report sat collecting dust for a whole decade. During this time, Barry began diagnosing and treating patients with gastritis in secret. He knew the real cure, and he wasn't about to let his patients suffer or die because of the ignorance of the medical community. Fortunately, in 1995, news of Barry's work began to spread. Doctors around the world started referring to him as the guinea pig doctor. Eager to get the word out, Barry capitalized on this new wave of interest, pushing the consequence of untreated gastritis into the public eye. He explained that people were dying and that immediate action was necessary. As a result, the FDA fast-tracked research into gastritis, and over the next few years, more and more studies were conducted, confirming that gastritis was caused by Helicobacter pylori bacteria. As the evidence mounted, confirming the link between gastritis and bacteria, Barry began to be hailed as a hero, so much so that in 1999 he was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society. Barry and Dr. Warren would later go on to win a Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. Over time, the two would receive countless awards for their groundbreaking work. Barry went on to found several companies focused on preventing and treating gut-related conditions, such as gastritis and irritable bowel syndrome. Thanks to the work of Barry and Dr. Warren, stomach cancer rates around the world have dropped significantly, and as a result, so have deaths. How many lives did Barry and Warren save? We can't say for sure, but one thing is certain: the two men absolutely changed the trajectory of medicine for the better. Leonid Rogosov is described as one of the bravest and most craziest doctors in history. For the most part, his life was simple and honestly quite boring. But what happened to him in Antarctica when he was 27 years old is truly one of the most insane stories I've ever heard. You see, Leonid Rogosov is one of the few people in history who has successfully performed surgery on himself. A feat that not only changed his life, but also permanently altered Russian policies. But to truly understand how Leonid was able to do this, we need to go back where it all began. The year was 1934. Siberia was under the rule of Joseph Stalin. Leonid Rogosov was born on March 14th in Dauria, a remote village in eastern Siberia. Life was difficult under Russia's industrialization and harsh policies, but for Leonid, things would only get harder. Leonid's father was soon sent off to join the war efforts against the rising threat of Germany. Leonid and his family prayed for his father's safe return, but in 1943 their hopes were crushed. His father was killed, leaving Leonid fatherless at just 9 years old. Yet these hardships only strengthened Leonid's resilience, a trait that would serve him well in the years to come. As he grew older, Leonid developed an interest in medicine, which led him to study at the Leningrad Pediatric Medical Institute in St. Petersburg, one of the oldest pediatric institutions in the world. He graduated as a general practitioner in 1959, before deciding to specialize in surgery. Then, through what was either happenstance or divine intervention, Leonid was offered the sole medic position on the 6th Soviet Antarctic expedition in 1960. At first, Leonid was hesitant. After all, he had only just completed his general medical training and was very inexperienced in surgery. What if something went wrong? But after a short stint of deliberation, Leonid decided that he was overthinking it. If something did go wrong, he would handle the situation as best he could. So driven by the thirst for adventure and the desire to learn, he accepted and embarked on his journey on the 5th of November 1960, a decision that would fundamentally change his life for both better and for worse. Chapter 1: A Dull Pain. The trip from Russia to Antarctica took a grueling 36 days by sea. The primary purpose of the expedition was to establish a new polar base at the Schermacher Oasis, one of the most inhospitable regions of the continent. The team had to move quickly as the polar winter was approaching, which would plunge the continent into 6 months of darkness. Fortunately, just a few months after arriving, and right before winter set in, Leonid and his 12 teammates finished building the base, which they later named Novolasevskaya. Leonid was primarily there as the team's only medical doctor, though it was common for him to also assist in meteorology and drive terrain vehicles. Life was hard, although it was also fulfilling, but it was about to take a drastic turn for the worse. On April 29, 1961, Leonid woke up feeling weak and unwell. Though he wasn't overly worried, after all, he was stationed in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. However, as the day went on, his weakness grew and was joined by a slight nausea. Then, things took a turn for the worse. By evening, Leonid developed a dull pain in the center of his abdomen that gradually shifted to the lower right side. He began to wonder if it might be appendicitis. His suspicions were confirmed when the dull pain slowly turned into a sharp pain in the lower right part of his abdomen, a pattern typical for patients with appendicitis. His body temperature began to rise to 37.4 degrees Celsius or 99.3 degrees Fahrenheit. At the time, doctors didn't have the advanced medical equipment we have today, like ultrasound and CT scans. Instead, they had to rely solely on their training to make an accurate diagnosis. For example, although the symptoms were typical for appendicitis, the issues Leonid was experiencing were also common in cases of mesenteric lymphadenitis, a condition where a lymph node in the stomach becomes swollen. As a result, Leonid tracked his symptoms day and night until he finally concluded that the correct diagnosis was appendicitis. Appendicitis occurs when the appendix, a small tube-like organ attached to the large intestine, becomes swollen and painful. For years, doctors were uncertain about the purpose of the appendix. Some believed it was an organ that once helped our herbivorous ancestors digest grass, while others thought it served no purpose at all. Today, however, modern doctors and researchers believe that the appendix plays a role in supporting our immune system by helping to fight off pathogens and by repopulating the gut with beneficial bacteria. When appendicitis goes untreated, the appendix can burst, leading to a life-threatening infection. For this reason, doctors typically remove the appendix when it is infected through surgery. After diagnosing himself with appendicitis, Leonid took antibiotics in the hopes that it would prevent his condition from worsening, but it was to no avail. By the end of the day, his condition had worsened into full-blown appendicitis, followed by an even more dangerous condition, pyoappendicitis, which is when the appendix is on the verge of bursting. At first, Leonid and his team searched for nearby stations that might have medical staff. But there was a major problem. The only one they could find was over 1,000 kilometers away, which at the time might as well have been on the other side of the world. While there were foreign stations nearby, none had medics, and the blizzard raging outside made traveling impossible. Leonid and his team were left with no other option. He would have to perform surgery on himself. Chapter 2: Desperate Measures. At 1 a.m. on April 31st, nearly 2 days after his symptoms began, Leonid's team prepared one of the station's rooms for surgery, while Leonid made a detailed plan of how he would perform the surgery. First, Leonid instructed two of his team members, Aerlo Kabot and R.N. Hysov, to place some of the equipment outside in the freezing cold to try and sterilize it. Leonid knew that the freezing cold temperatures wouldn't completely sterilize the equipment, but he was confident it would at least slow down the growth of bacteria and microorganisms. Still, as he watched the two place the equipment outside, he couldn't shake the worry that it wouldn't be enough to prevent an infection. Next, Leonid prepared a sterile solution of 0.5% Novocaine to be used as a local anesthetic. The amount was crucial. He needed just enough to numb the pain, but not so much that it would impact his ability to perform surgery. You see, too much Novocaine could result in Leonid passing out, or worse, it could kill him. But since Novocaine was a local anesthetic and not a general one, he knew that he would still have to endure a lot of pain. Considering his very limited experience as a surgeon from his training, the odds were completely stacked against him. Then, Leonid enlisted the help of the team's meteorologist Artemyev and the driver Teplinsky. Artemyev would be responsible for holding the retractors, while Teplinsky would hold a mirror to allow Leonid to see the areas that were out of his line of sight. Finally, Leonid gave his bootstrap medical team instructions of what to do in the event that he lost consciousness during the procedure. With everything in place, Leonid positioned himself in a semi-reclined stance, his body slightly turned to the left to ensure that he could see everything he needed. He then began to administer the 0.5% Novocaine anesthetic to his abdomen.
My poor assistants. At the last minute, I looked over them. They stood there in their surgical whites, whiter than white themselves. I was scared too. When I picked up the needle with the Novocaine, I gave myself the first injection. Somehow I automatically switched into operating mode, and from that point on, I didn't notice anything else.
At 2 a.m., Leonid began the procedure by making a 5 to 10 centimeter or 2 to 4 inch wide incision in the wall of his abdomen. He first cut through the skin, then a layer of fat, followed by 3 layers of muscle and a layer of fascia, until he reached a depth of around 5 to 10 centimeters or 2 to 4 inches, where he would find the peritoneum, a thin layer of membrane that covers the appendix. Initially, everything went according to plan. The anesthetic was working and the mirror was doing its job, though Leonid occasionally had to raise his head and lean forward, which activated his stomach muscles and caused excruciating pain.
I worked without gloves. It was hard to see. The mirror helps, but it also hinders. After all, it's showing things backwards. I work mainly by touch. The bleeding is quite heavy, but I take my time. I try to work surely.
As time passed, Leonid began to develop extreme dizziness, forcing him to take short breaks to stabilize himself and catch his breath. Then, disaster struck. Due to the dizziness he was feeling and his lack of surgical experience, he accidentally cut part of his large intestine, the cecum. Cutting into the large intestine was arguably the worst thing that could have happened, as it could cause intestinal contents to leak into the abdomen, leading to a serious life-threatening infection.
Suddenly, it flashed in my mind that there were more injuries here, and I didn't notice them. I grew weaker and weaker.
Leonid felt a surge of despair. It would have been easy to give up and let the darkness take over. But he was a man shaped by the harsh Russian occupation, a man who had grown from a boy without his father's help. He hadn't given up then, and he wouldn't give up now. He was fighting for his life, in the fight of his life. With the help of his makeshift surgical assistants, he stitched up his large intestine and continued with the appendectomy. The pain was manageable thanks to the anesthetic, but the hardest part was fighting the urge to lose consciousness. Meanwhile, Gerborvik, another member of the expedition, watched closely.
When Leonid made the incision and was manipulating his own innards as he removed the appendix, his intestine gurgled, which was highly unpleasant for us. It made one want to turn away, flee, not look, but I kept my head and stayed. Artemiev and Teplinsky also held their places, although it later turned out that they were both quite dizzy and were close to fainting. Leonid himself was calm and focused on his work, but sweat was running down his face, and he frequently asked Teplinsky to wipe his forehead.
Leonid worked tirelessly through the night until he finally removed the appendix, which had a dark stain on the bottom, indicating that he was very close to bursting. Given the environment and his lack of surgical skills, that would have been a death sentence for him. By 4 a.m., Leonid had successfully controlled the bleeding, stitching himself up, and completed the surgery. Naturally, Leonid and his team assumed that the worst was behind them. They were wrong. Chapter 3: Unusual Clarity. Shortly after surgery, Leonid administered a general anesthetic to himself, which put him unconscious. In the first few days following the operation, he was gripped by a relentless fever that threatened his life. However, by day 5, the fever had mostly subsided and he was on the road to recovery. By day 14, Leonid had returned to his regular duties and was even tasked with manual labor, shocking his fellow crew members. For the next year, Leonid carried on as he had before. Physically, he looked the same, but mentally, he had become a changed man. In April 1962, the team was scheduled to be picked up and returned home. However, a vicious storm ripped across the continent, making it impossible for the ships to pick them up. For what seemed like an eternity, Leonid and his team faced the terrifying realization that they might have to stay there for another year.
More and more often, waves of dull homesickness and deep hatred of this cursed Antarctica washed over me. How odd it seems that I ever agreed to go on this expedition. All the exoticism of Antarctica had worn off within a month, and in return, I'm losing 2 years of my life. My clinic, which I love more than any worldly pleasure, seems as far from here as Mars.
Fortunately, the storm eventually subsided, but the challenges were far from over. Multiple single-engine planes landed at Novolazerskaya base to take them away. Leonid released a final sigh of relief as he looked out the window and saw his comrades on another plane beside him. But then everything went wrong. In an instant, one of the planes suffered a catastrophic failure and plummeted from the sky. For what seemed like an eternity, Leonid sat there, wondering if his friends were alive or dead. and whether his plane would be the next to fall. Fortunately, the crew managed to restart the engine just before the plane plunged into the sea. Upon returning to Russia, Leonid was awarded the Order of the Red Banner of Labor, a prestigious honor given to those who had performed great feats for the Soviet Union. When he was asked about the incredible story, he humbly remarked that it was
a job like any other, a life like any other.
But Leonid's actions went beyond earning a medal and creating a remarkable story. He also helped enact policy changes. From that point on, extensive health checks were required for all members of expeditionary teams before they left the Soviet Union. The goal was to identify any potential life-threatening issue before departure, so that they could prevent such dire circumstances from occurring again. At the time of surgery, Leonid believed that he had performed the first ever self-appendectomy. However, his assumption was false. There had been others before him, including Bertram F. Alden in 1912 and an Australian soldier who was forced to hold his assistant at gunpoint while performing surgery on himself. Stories that I will cover in future videos, so make sure to subscribe and ring the bell icon to get notified. Regardless, what Leonid and his crew accomplished was nothing short of a miracle. You might think that self-surgery like this would lead to further complication down the road, but that wasn't the case for Leonid. In fact, he went on to get married, have children, and live a long and fruitful life, only passing away in 2000 from lung cancer at the age of 66. When asked about his father, Leonid's son, Vladislav, simply said,
"He was a man who faced life's hardest challenges head-on and never backed down, no matter the odds. If you find yourself in a seemingly desperate situation when all the odds are against you, even if you are in the middle of the most hostile environment, do not give up. Believe in yourself and fight. Fight for life."
Without a doubt, Leonid Rogozov is one of the bravest and most skilled doctors in history. Imagine for a moment that you're a soldier in the Crimean War. If you're wondering where Crimea is, don't worry. So were many of the real soldiers at the time. Like many of these men, you're wounded at some time during the campaign. Fortunately, it isn't that bad, just a quick in and out through the leg. What is bad is the field hospital you're taken to for surgery. Not only is virtually every bed filled with moaning, injured, and sick men, but the floors are literally covered in blood and waste. Flies buzz in swarms around the air, going from pools of rancid blood to wounded patient and back again all day and night long. You're only there for stitches, but you soon fall deathly ill. Your fever rises to 103 degrees Fahrenheit or 39.4 Celsius, then higher. You become delirious and eventually you die. Like most men fighting in this conflict, you weren't taken out by Russian bullets, but from the infections acquired in the very places designed to save you. It was into this terrifying situation that a wealthy young lady named Florence Nightingale entered sometime in 1854. She didn't know it at the time, but she was about to create, or at least legitimize, a whole new medical profession. The problem of medical sanitation in the 1850s. In the mid-19th century, you'd often hear a sick person say that they would rather die than go to the hospital. This was not hyperbole, because going to the hospital dramatically increased the chances that you would contract a deadly infection. Sepsis, gangrene, and other infections were common following even minor surgeries, while mortality rates for surgeries like amputation could be as high as 80%. The primary cause of all this misery was hygiene, or more specifically, the lack thereof. Medical professionals of the day operated with only the faintest understanding of how infections spread. Germ theory was still a distant revelation, and the dominant belief was that bad air was the culprit behind most post-surgery ailments. The good news? This meant you often got to die outside. Inside the hospital wards, the filth was overwhelming. Physicians and attendants moved from patient to patient without wiping, let alone washing their hands. Surgical tools were merely given a cursory rinse before reuse, while the linens and bandages were rarely changed and just as rarely fresh in the first place. Even in large city hospitals, the floors were often encrusted with dirt, bodily fluids, and waste. Looking back, it's hardly surprising that such environments bred infections like typhoid, cholera, and sepsis. And as bad as all this is, field hospitals used during armed conflict were even worse. However, several enterprising and insightful individuals would change all of this, literally pushing the medical world into the future inch by inch. One such person was Florence Nightingale. Early life and call to service. Born in Florence, Italy in 1820, Florence Nightingale's early life was almost entirely shaped by privilege. Her wealthy British parents, Frances and William Edward Nightingale, were forward-thinking for the day, at least in some respects. As a result of their progressivism, they decided to provide their young girl with an exceptional education, something altogether uncommon for women at the time. Tutored in mathematics, philosophy, science, and the classics by her father, Florence displayed a sharp intellect and an aptitude for data analysis, two skills that would come to define her later career. Despite her intellectual pursuits, societal expectations remained an issue for both her and her parents. The Nightingales upheld rigid Victorian ideals which dictated that wealthy women should marry well-to-do men and remain within the domestic sphere. This fact loomed particularly large over Florence, who at age 16 experienced what she described as divine calling to serve the sick and suffering. She was determined to become a nurse, but when she told her parents, she was met with outrage. Though the profession existed, it was seen as something for the unfortunate classes. Nurses were thought to drink, flirt, and dabble in prostitution to make their wages. For someone of Florence's status, to say that she wanted to pursue such a calling was seen as akin to a duchess wanting to slop the pigs. Despite familial opposition, Florence remained resolute. She shunned both men and women, friendship and romance. Eventually, she met Mary Clark, an intellectual hostess and progressive who further encouraged Florence to follow her dreams. Finally, her family relented. Her training began in Germany, where she studied hospital administration and patient care at the Lutheran faculty. In 1853, with financial support from her father, she became the superintendent of the Institution for Sick Gentlewomen in London. Though she had several suitors, she repeatedly chose her vocation over societal expectation of marriage. Though she is not alive to tell us in her own words, her correspondence indicates that her decision affected her deeply. In fact, she often retreated into intense bouts of depression, which she would overcome by channeling her feelings into her work. And it clearly paid off. Florence's early career was equally marked by a penchant for hands-on nursing and organizational innovation. By the time the Crimean War broke out in 1854, Florence was uniquely prepared to tackle one of history's greatest public health crises: the Crimean War. The war began as a power struggle between the Russian Empire and the alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire, with battles raging on the Crimean Peninsula and surrounding territories. More than 615,000 lives would be lost during the two-year conflict, with more than 80% of those being non-combat-related fatalities. Indeed, the Crimean War saw men fighting in some of the most horrific conditions ever seen. Soldiers lived in overcrowded, filthy camps with little attention to personal cleanliness. Bathing and clean water were rare luxuries, leading to widespread lice infestations and poor overall hygiene. In almost all cases, camps and bases lacked any proper facilities for disposing of human waste, which contaminated the camps and spread disease. Cholera, typhus, dysentery, and scurvy ran rampant through the ranks. and the centerpiece of all this human misery was the overcrowded, disease-ridden hospital wards at Scutari in modern-day Istanbul. The war was nearly half over when the Times began reporting on the dismal camp and hospital conditions. Not only was the support for the conflict at an all-time low, but now the British citizens were learning that the majority of the death stemmed from illness rather than battle. While she was still young, Nightingale's reputation preceded her. English Secretary of War Sidney Herbert reached out for help, and she happily agreed. On October 21st, 1854, she departed for the Ottoman Empire with a team of 38 volunteer nurses, including nuns and her head nurse, Elysia Roberts. When Nightingale and her team arrived at Selimiye barracks in November of that year, they found themselves in the middle of an unrelenting crisis. Medicines were scarce, hygiene was neglected, and facilities lacked even basic provisions for preparing food. Nightingale's journals described the entire camp as having a layer of filth on every surface, noting that the smell of death permeated the air. To make matters worse, Nightingale's team soon learned that the reports were true. The mortality rate at the field hospitals was 42%, with 10 soldiers dying from disease for every one that succumbed to his battle wounds. Nightingale wasted no time. Drawing on her background in hospital administration, she implemented systematic changes. Cleanliness became her first priority. Under her direction, the nurses scrubbed the wards, washed linens, and helped introduce more sanitary food preparation practices. As a wise lady, she appealed to the Times back in England, the very same paper that had published the stories about the camp. This time, she requested the deployment of the Sanitary Commission, which flushed out the hospital's defective sewers and established a more reliable water supply. By the time the war was nearing its end, the mortality rate at her facility has dropped to just 2.2%. The Lady with the Lamp. Nightingale's reforms were vital to the survival of thousands of men, but that was not her only contribution. For many wounded and sick soldiers, her hands-on care became a beacon of hope. By night, she carried her lamp through the darkened corridors of the hospital, checking on patients and providing comfort. It was in this image of Florence, gliding silently through the wards, her light casting shadows on the walls, that truly captivated the public imagination. However, Nightingale's efforts were not without challenges. She frequently clashed with male doctors and military officials who resisted her authority and questioned her methods. She also had issues with many of the Catholic nuns who came to help tend to the sick, but who refused to cede authority to a woman. Nevertheless, her results spoke for themselves. By the time the war ended in 1856, she had already changed the way hundreds of medical professionals thought about hygiene. More importantly, she helped legitimize nursing as a medical practice in which women were capable of doing virtually anything a doctor could, sometimes better. A woman before her time. After arriving home, Nightingale, a voracious writer and note-taker, authored 2 publications, Notes on Nursing and Notes on Hospitals, both of which became foundational texts for the healthcare industry. Among other things, these works emphasized sanitation, patient-centered care, and efficient hospital management, things that are still vital to the modern medical industry. Florence also used her statistical expertise to advocate for healthcare reform. For instance, she created the polar area diagram, a precursor to modern data visualization, to illustrate the preventable death caused by poor sanitation. Thanks to her data-driven argument, she was able to successfully lobby governments to improve public health infrastructure, including rural sanitation projects in India. However, it was at this time that she began to suffer from a number of chronic illnesses. From 1857 onwards, Nightingale was frequently bedridden due to these ongoing conditions. Beyond that, she suffered recurring bouts of severe depression. Though she remained hidden from the public for most of her later life, she continued her efforts in earnest, pouring her problems into her work just as she had done earlier. She established the Nightingale Training School for Nurses at St. Thomas Hospital in 1860, further helping to transform the field into a respected and structured profession. This initiative not only improved patient care, but also provided women with an opportunity for meaningful work outside of traditional domestic roles. In fact, graduates of the program became known as Nightingale nurses and were sought after for their expertise. Nightingale's advocacy for social reform wasn't limited to healthcare. She worked tirelessly to expand opportunities for women, particularly in education and employment. By proving that women could excel in roles traditionally dominated by men, she helped pave the way for future generations to enter fields like medicine, public health, and social work. We have videos of some of those pioneers coming up, so make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified. In many ways, Florence Nightingale was a woman ahead of her time, an innovator who refused to be constrained by the expectation of her era. Though she was bedridden much of her later life, she managed to live until the ripe old age of 90, allowing her to see many of the changes she helped implement come to fruition. Above all, she showed that one person, armed with conviction and compassion, could reshape the entire system and challenge the status quo. All it takes is a little determination and a candle to light the way. Welcome home, doughboy. You survived the Great War. Despite spending months in wet trenches, dodging German bullets and bombs, you have finally made it home to your beloved New York City. You march proudly through the streets with your fellow veterans as American men, women, and children crowd the sidewalks to cheer you on. They drop confetti, they shake your hand. Heck, some of the women even let you sneak in a kiss or two. But the celebration doesn't last long. You wake up in the apartment the next day, safe and sound. However, you don't feel well at all. A few too many drinks? No, this is something else. A high fever, a pounding headache, chills that cause you to shake down to your bones. You better head to the local infirmary. Just 2 days later, you're lying in a hospital bed, unable to breathe and watching as your arms, face, and fingers turn blue. In less than 24 hours, you'll be dead. You may have dodged the Kaiser, but you couldn't dodge the flu. The Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 and 1919 was the deadliest global illness since the Black Death. But where did it come from? How did it spread? And most important of all, how can we keep it from happening again? In this video, we'll answer all these questions and so much more. What the flu was before vaccines. Influenza, often referred to as the flu, is an infectious disease caused by influenza viruses. Depending on the type of flu, how new or novel it is, and what tools are available to fight it, the flu can either be a mild inconvenience or a severe, life-threatening illness. Nowadays, we only think about the flu when we get our yearly shots, or in the event those vaccines don't work, when we get a mild illness requiring a few days at home. However, the first of these treatments only dates back to around 1940. Before then, the flu was serious business. Physicians lacked antiviral drugs, which meant they really only worked to make the infected comfortable while simply hoping they didn't die. Secondary bacterial infections like pneumonia commonly followed the flu, and without antibiotics, which weren't available until after 1928, these complications were frequently fatal. Poor hygiene and a limited understanding of germ theory helped spread it even more. If you were sick, young or old, you were pretty much written off the moment you demonstrated a fever. If you did survive, you could take comfort in knowing you now had some limited immunity to the virus. Today, we know that there is more than one flu. In fact, the flu virus exists in several forms, types A, B, C, and D, each targeting different hosts. Long before the modern era, we humans knew to expect seasonal flu epidemics, which varied in their deadliness. In the US, the flu generally killed around 20 to 50,000 people a year. But once the flu season ended, most people accepted that they were generally safe. Pandemics, however, are different. These global outbreaks occur when a new strain of the virus emerges. This means that anyone who had immunity to the previous variants were vulnerable again. As a result, new strains spread quickly, leading to millions of deaths and striking the ill, healthy, old, and the young in equal measure. In the past centuries of recorded history, we have been aware of 10 such pandemics. The 11th and deadliest would eventually be known as the Spanish flu. Contrary to popular belief, it did not originate from Spain. So how did it then end up with that name? A new kind of war. Earth had never seen anything quite like World War I. Millions of soldiers from dozens of countries had been mobilized, armed with the latest killing machines, and turned loose upon each other in a global conflict that killed up to 16 million people. But just as the war finally began to draw to a close, a new threat emerged. One that would kill at least 3 times as many people, but possibly up to 6 times or more. The worst part? There were no shiny new weapons with which to fight this new menace. Despite being referred to as the Spanish flu today, this illness most likely did not originate in Spain. In fact, many historians now agree that it started in the good old US of A, specifically in the Midwest. The pandemic's first documented case occurred on March 4th, 1918, at Camp Funston, a US Army training camp located near Manhattan, Kansas. On that day, an army cook named Albert Gitschel came to the infirmary to report flu-like symptoms. Days later, logs at the base reported as many as 500 soldiers had fallen ill. But there was a war on, and wars don't stop because of one little outbreak. As a result, those soldiers healthy enough to fight were given the orders and shipped off to bigger bases at home and abroad. By March 11th, the virus had spread to the other Manhattan. By April, it was already overseas, where it used the crowded trenches and military camps to breathe with unheard of efficiency. In fact, medical historians often say that the pandemic might not have happened at all without World War I. The malnutrition, poor sanitation, and physical exhaustion that accompanied this new form of warfare weakened the immune system of grunts and officers alike. But wartime media censorship prevented many nations from reporting on the outbreak in an attempt to maintain morale. Only Spain, which was neutral in the conflict, reported on the fast-spreading pandemic. As such, people began to erroneously believe it must have originated there, hence the Spanish flu. For the last few months of the war, several armies reported that more soldiers were put into infirmaries for breathing problems and fever than bullet wounds. And when the war ended in November of 1918, all of those men were sent home with their germs in tow. The same flu had already started wreaking havoc in places like New York, Paris, London, and Berlin. However, things hadn't gotten bad enough to stop citizens from welcoming the returning soldiers with parades, drinks, and more than a few public makeout sessions. Before long, the illness quite literally went viral. Little did they know, it was just the beginning. The second wave. Truth be told, the first wave of the Spanish flu was relatively mild. The United States reported around 75,000 flu-related deaths in the first 6 months of 1918, only around 12,000 more than the year before. But the second wave, which began in August of 1918, was catastrophic. Where the initial outbreak resembled typical flu epidemics, primarily affecting the sick and elderly, the second wave was an equal opportunity infector. Military parades for brave troops became super spreader events, with one Philadelphia procession being linked to 12,000 deaths in just a few weeks. In the US, nearly 292,000 people died between September and December alone, 1,023% more than the 1915 figures. The figures were the same in other towns and cities around the world. The worst part, there was not much that anyone could do about it. At the time, medical science was completely ill-equipped to combat the virus. Scientists hadn't even discovered the influenza virus yet. As far as they knew, and some even believed, the flu was caused by ghosts or an angry god. Those secondary bacterial infections that tend to make the flu more deadly were untreated due to the lack of antibiotics, and public health measures were rudimentary at best. Efforts to control the spread primarily relied on non-pharmaceutical interventions, like isolation, quarantine, and social distancing. Gauze masks were worn by some, but shunned by many. Moreover, those Victorian PPE measures may not have been that helpful in the first place. Across the world, the dreaded second wave proved to be one of the deadliest public health crises in history. And there were still 2 more waves to go. Causes, responses, and general insanity. You might be asking yourself, given the lack of medical knowledge in the early 1900s, there must have been some rather insane reactions and theories associated with the Spanish flu. Well, you'd be right. But to truly understand the pandemic, you need to get a good idea of how many people were dying and how fast it was happening. Because while the virus spread the fastest in crowded urban areas, it did some of the most complete damage in rural ones. This was especially true of indigenous communities, whose isolation had previously kept them safe from such events. In fact, newspapers of the era reported entire native villages being either wiped out or losing the majority of their adult population. Still, urban areas fared no better. In the first few weeks of the second wave, New York City buried 33,000 victims, and Philadelphia lost nearly 13,000 people. The sheer volume of deaths overwhelmed infrastructure, forcing cities to use street cars as makeshift hearses, while thousands of bodies remained unburied in their home for days. As is the case with all pandemics, some entrepreneurial types saw the opportunity to make a few bucks. Prices for coffins and burial services skyrocketed, with reports of prices hiking as high as 600%. In some cases, families were charged exorbitant fees only to be told they had to dig the grave themselves. But there were also plenty of people doing their part to stop the virus spread, or at least trying to, often with hilarious or terrifying results. Boston officials shut down public schools, salons, and soda shops. Chicago police arrested anyone caught sneezing or coughing in public. Nashville prohibited gatherings in movie theaters, dance halls, and churches, even ordering ministers to forgo services. Mask mandates became widespread in places like San Francisco. However, the crackdown spurred some people to rebel, allowing them to turn everyday activities, like going to church or walking around maskless, into acts of defiance against governmental overreach. There was even an anti-mask league, which described being forced to wear face coverings as an act of tyranny. Even though people were dying in droves, every step toward containment was met with ardent resistance. Some so-called doctors promoted miracle cures or prevention methods, which varied from useless and harmless remedies such as aspirin or quinine to deadly and extreme, such as drinking arsenic. We'll cover more such extreme remedies in future videos, so make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. In India, offerings were made to appease the goddess Sitala, believed to be behind the plague, while Spaniards wore garlic necklaces in hopes of warding off illness. Equally harmful were the assumptions about the virus' origins, with some blaming the noxious gases used during World War I, others claiming that the pandemic was a secret weapon unleashed by the Germans in a last-ditch attempt to prevent their defeat. The flu's impact on the world. Between February 1918 and April 1920, approximately 1/3 of the entire global population contracted the Spanish flu. Healthcare systems were overwhelmed to the point of breakdown, with many people having to rely on makeshift facilities constructed in schools, homes, and other buildings. Nurses and doctors were in short supply, which meant that these hastily constructed facilities were often staffed by medical students and untrained volunteers. Globally, the toll was staggering. India alone reported 12.5 to 20 million deaths. Many island nations sealed their borders completely in order to stop the spread of the virus, with varying success. Less populated islands like Iceland and Samoa fared quite well, while places like Australia still suffered heavy infection rates, though casualties were low. But the pandemic had other effects as well, including a wave of cultural and social adaptations. Churches were among the first to adapt, with many turning to outdoor or drive-in services where worshippers listened from carriages or cars. Even though most people didn't even believe in germ theory, many adopted obsessive cleaning practices. Public spaces were fumigated, personal belongings were disinfected, and people developed a newfound love of hand washing. Around the world, millions of citizens did their best to prevent the spread of the virus, while others unknowingly did their worst to contribute to it. As people split into factions, government struggled to maintain control. In some cases, violence erupted. Meanwhile, economic chaos ensued as panic buying and hoarding depleted supplies. Inflation soared and labor unrest followed in many nations. Fortunately, by mid-1920, the worst of the pandemic seemed to have subsided. The virus itself, H1N1, didn't disappear, but simply evolved into a more familiar seasonal flu. To this day, its descendants continue to circulate, occasionally causing significant outbreaks and deaths, but nothing like what was seen during 1918 and 1919. The Spanish flu's legacy is all around us. Most notably, it served as a catalyst for advancements in medical science, including vaccines, antiviral drugs, and antibiotics to combat secondary infections. It also underscored the importance of early intervention, access to healthcare, and global cooperation alongside information sharing. But if you're watching this right now, you know that pandemics are still a very real threat. In fact, many of the stories related to this video could easily have been taken from the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. Though different in many ways, both of these viral events exposed society's vulnerability to novel infectious diseases, a problem that is not going away anytime soon. In fact, depending on which medical research you read, we could be on track for more pandemics in the near future. Globalization, urbanization, climate change, and the increasing frequency of zoonotic spillovers from wildlife to humans make future outbreaks more likely and potentially deadlier. The challenge now is to ensure that these lessons are not forgotten, but rather used to build a world better equipped to confront whatever comes next.
It's 1927. You wake up one morning with a sore throat, rash, and fever. After a week of not feeling better, you finally decided to call the local physician. He arrives, feels your neck, and inspects your tonsils. Finally, he delivers the crushing blow. You have strep throat. Your family members in the room begin to cry. almost unable to look you in the eye. A pit forms in your stomach as you weakly ask, "How long do I have left?" Grim-faced, the doctor shakes his head, sadly explaining how the bacteria will spread to your sinuses and ears, then into your bloodstream, heart, lungs, or brain. Depending on your definition of luck, you'll either be dead in 24 hours or 24 days. This was the story for tens of thousands of people every year from the beginning of modern times until 1928. It wasn't until that year that a Scottish microbiologist with a tendency to be a bit messy would take a holiday to the beach and change medical science forever. Centuries after the days when doctors talked of black magic and bodily humors, medicine was still fraught with risk. Even though medical professionals were far more informed about how the body worked than they had been previously, they were still woefully unprepared to combat the constant barrage of illnesses affecting their patients. Perhaps the worst culprit of all was bacteria, which was quite literally everywhere. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, syphilis, and strep throat, all of which are rather easily treated today, were a death sentence for anywhere from 15 to 50% of those infected. Even a simple cut or scrape could quickly spiral out of control, eventually leading to sepsis and death. Today, few people realize that for the vast majority of the time humans have been on Earth, a sliver in the finger could be a death sentence. And if it wasn't, the process to remove it could do the job just as well. After all, the risks associated with surgery meant that many procedures, even minor ones, carried significant danger. Childbirth, the most natural process on Earth, would often leave women suffering from puerperal fever, a bacterial infection contracted during delivery. In fact, risks to mothers and babies were so high that some cultures avoided naming infants until they reached at least 2 years old. Even if you did make it to adolescence, your life would be spent in constant threat of an early grave. The average life expectancy in the U.S. in the early 1920s was around 56 years. If you were a member of the underclass, that dropped down to around 45 years. And in millions of cases each year, it was a bacterial infection that did the victim in. Bacteria, small, single-celled organisms, are among the most abundant and diverse forms of life on Earth. They live in water, soil, air, and inside other organisms, including the foods we eat. There are billions inside your body right now, helping you digest your food and keeping you healthy. But not all bacteria are beneficial. Some, known as pathogens, can cause diseases when they make their way into plants, animals, and humans. So what did we do about it? Well, most of the time, we died. Even after engineers managed to build the Titanic, antibiotics were more of a dream than a reality, with doctors relying almost entirely on external antiseptics and the patient's beleaguered immune system. For reference, physicians hadn't even understood the importance of hand washing until it was suggested by a Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis in, wait for it, 1847. Even then, they laughed at him for years until he actually proved the practice was valid. So, in an effort to treat infections, doctors turned to a variety of remedies, some more questionable than others. Herbal remedies like garlic and vinegar were popular, but their ability to combat bacterial infections was limited. In many cases, wounds were doused in alcohol or carbolic acid, or pints of blood were drained from patients via hoses or leeches. For more internal issues like syphilis, toxic substances like mercury and arsenic were sometimes used. But these cures often did more harm than good. The inability to treat bacterial infections led to a strong focus on prevention. Doctors emphasized hygiene and sanitation, knowing that preventing infections was often their only defense. Despite their best efforts, even routine illnesses like urinary tract infections were killing thousands of people a year in the most advanced cities in the world. But Alexander Fleming changed all of that. Sir Alexander Fleming was born in Ayrshire, Scotland in 1881. Though he seemed intent on working in shipping, he inherited some money and decided to attend medical school. Like most lads from the UK, he fought in World War I before returning to work at St. Mary's Hospital in London. While brilliant, Fleming earned a reputation for being a bit eccentric, and when he committed himself to studying the effects of Staphylococcus bacteria, a strain he'd seen do immense damage to his fellow soldiers during the war, expectations were mostly tempered. One of his most common eccentricities was a tendency to be a bit messy, often leaving his laboratory tables crowded with papers and samples from his projects. In September 1928, Fleming inoculated some petri dishes with bacterial cultures, but failed to clean them up before leaving his lab that evening. This wouldn't have been a problem, except that he was leaving to go on vacation in Suffolk with his family. Upon returning, he noticed that one of the dishes had become contaminated with mold. And here's where his other eccentricity, overwhelming curiosity, comes into play. Instead of discarding the dish, as many scientists might have done, Fleming instead put it under his microscope. Upon doing so, he instantly discovered that all of the bacteria surrounding the mold had been killed, while those farther away were still thriving. Somehow, the mold was producing a substance capable of killing bacteria. Upon studying the mold, he identified it as Penicillium notatum, a fungus that feeds on decaying organic matter in soil, vegetation, and indoor environments. In failing to put away his bacteria samples and leaving them alone for such a long period, Fleming had allowed them to become infected with the fungus. This, in turn, allowed him to discover an inexpensive miracle cure to one of the biggest problems in the history of medicine, penicillin. Though he was aware of the implications of his discovery right away, isolating and producing penicillin in large quantities proved to be a major challenge, and it would be years before Fleming's discovery gained the recognition it deserved. It wasn't until a team of scientists at Oxford University picked up where Fleming left off that the full potential of penicillin was realized. Their work in the late 1930s and early 1940s enabled the mass production of penicillin, making it widely available and saving countless lives by the time the next major war arrived. To say that the introduction of penicillin in the 1940s was revolutionary would be an almost criminal understatement. It marked the beginning of a completely new era in medicine. With the advent of this new antibiotic, doctors suddenly had a powerful tool to combat once deadly diseases. Pneumonia, which had been a leading cause of death, especially among children and the elderly, became far more treatable. Strep throat, which could lead to rheumatic fever and permanent heart damage, was now so easy to treat that patients could return to work after just a few days of downtime. Of course, penicillin's impact on surgery was equally profound. Surgeons could now perform more complex and invasive procedures with much greater confidence that their patients would recover without complications. As such, surgeons took more risks, which led to the development of advanced surgical techniques, including organ transplants and open heart surgery. And don't forget the children, because penicillin also revolutionized childbirth, significantly reducing maternal and infant mortality rates. By 1950, life expectancy in the U.S. had ballooned to 65 years for men and over 71 years for women. It's worth mentioning that Fleming's investigations into bacteria were mostly inspired by the medical horrors he witnessed during World War I. In those days, the most common treatment for bacterial infection was amputation, a solution that was nearly as likely to result in their death anyway. But Fleming got his revenge. During World War II, penicillin was used to treat infected wounds in soldiers, drastically reducing the number of wartime deaths from infection by more than 30%. Finally, the discovery of penicillin also spurred a wave of research into other antibiotics. Drugs like streptomycin and tetracycline were developed in the following decades, further expanding doctors' ability to treat bacterial infections. Alexander Fleming was the best kind of celebrity, an accidental one. Through actions that would otherwise be referred to as borderline irresponsible, he was able to save millions of lives in his lifetime and will likely save billions more in the coming centuries. Every single person who has ever suffered strep throat, a UTI, or other bacterial infection and lived to tell the tale owes this plucky Scotsman a debt of gratitude. Surgery is never a good thing. However, if you were unlucky enough to live in the 1800s, your chances of surviving a surgical procedure were abysmal. Still, from the doctor's perspective, at least only one person would be at risk, right? Wrong. In one astounding case, 19th century surgeon Robert Liston managed to perform a surgery with a staggering 300% mortality rate. But there's more to it than that. Because while Liston is often cited for just this one failure, he was actually a powerful patient advocate and an overwhelmingly positive figure in the brutal and chaotic history of surgery as a practice. 1800s surgery was a nightmare. Surgery in the early 1800s was a last resort, but that doesn't mean it was uncommon. Even though medical knowledge was getting better by the year, doctors were still woefully unprepared to keep their patients alive after cutting them open. Here's why. First, anesthesia didn't become widely available until the late 1840s. This meant that patients would need to endure surgery while fully awake. Of course, the pain could drive patients to writhe uncontrollably, so assistants were tasked with restraining them. Though the use of ether and chloroform would help change this, surgeries up until that point were excruciating, traumatic ordeals that could easily end in death due to shock or blood loss. Then there's the matter of germs, specifically the fact that doctors didn't know about them. As we've pointed out in other videos, doctors weren't even washing their hands until the end of the century, so even good surgeons reused tools without cleaning them and wore blood-stained aprons, which made the chances of post-surgery infection super high. Finally, we have to consider what most surgeries were: amputations. If a person had an injury or infection on a limb, doctors felt the best chance of saving it was to just cut the thing off. This would remove the infected wound, sure, but it also led to rampant blood loss. To minimize this and keep patients from literally dying from shock, surgeons often raced against the clock, relying on sheer speed to complete the procedure. And did we mention that most surgeries were done publicly, with students, doctors, and random spectators crowding around the racing doctor? In short, 1800s surgery was a chaotic mix of blood, bacteria, and screams. And it was still your best chance of surviving an infected wound. Fortunately, one surgeon quickly established himself as the best of the bunch. Robert Liston, the medical marvel. Robert Liston was born in Ecclesmachan, Scotland, in 1794. His father was a clergyman and inventor, which gave Liston a disciplined upbringing and a knack for innovation. After studying at Edinburgh Medical School, he worked under several prominent doctors. By 1835, Liston had been appointed the first professor of clinical surgery at University College Hospital in London. To put it as simple as possible, Liston was the man. He not only had a reputation for speed and skill, but his commitment to his patients was unmatched. Records state that he would often walk around hospitals looking for cases that others considered hopeless. He saved more than a few lives by operating on people who had basically been abandoned to die. And though he had a reputation for being argumentative with other doctors, he was widely respected by those he treated, especially poorer people who could rarely afford quality medical care. Many historians now claim that it's possible the negative opinions of Liston stemmed from a combination of jealousy at his skill and wealthy doctors being grossed out by his affinity for the poor. The fastest knife in the West End. Where Liston truly shined was in the practice of amputations. Liston's remarkable speed earned him the nickname the fastest knife in the West End, and it's rumored that he could sometimes complete an amputation in under 30 seconds. This not only reduced the trauma to the patient, but would help reduce the risk of infection. As such, Liston's mortality rate was relatively low, around 15%, compared to an average of 25% among his peers. But it wasn't all about showing off. Liston's writings indicate that he believed in the importance of avoiding unnecessary surgery whenever possible. Again, his dedication to minimizing patient suffering set him apart in an era when patients were frequently viewed as disposable. Yet Liston's success was not without challenges. After clashing with other surgeons, he was forced to take his practice into the homes of his patients. But there was a benefit to this. In treating people where they lived, Liston spared them the horrors of early hospitals, which were so unsanitary that you were actually more likely to die inside than out. Still, that doesn't mean he was immune to mistakes. Sometime in the 1830s or 40s, he made a blunder that would tarnish his reputation forever. The truth behind the 300% mortality rate. This particular incident took place at University College Hospital in London, where Liston's reputation for speed and precision had drawn a large crowd of spectators eager to watch his techniques in action. In the operating theater, Liston prepared to perform one of his famous leg amputations, with the audience packed tightly around him. To stabilize the leg, Liston asked for assistance from one of the medical students. After asking the attendees to start their watches, as he always did, he began cutting. As always, Liston's focus was on speed. However, as he began to cut, he accidentally removed 2 of the fingers of the assisting medical student. Suddenly, he had both men bleeding profusely and a half-cut leg that nobody was holding. Liston's only hope was to keep going. However, amid his quick movements, he ended up catching the coattails of a senior doctor standing nearby with his knife. Thinking he'd been wounded, the senior surgeon cried out in shock and collapsed to the floor. Though he was uninjured, the fear and adrenaline were too much for him, leading to a massive heart attack that killed him on the spot. But the tragedy didn't end there. Both the patient and the assistant would go on to develop gangrene, with each man dying in the following days. And that's how a single operation resulted in the deaths of 3 people. To this day, it remains the only known surgery in history to produce a 300% mortality rate. This tale of tragic miscalculation and misfortune became infamous, not only for the deaths involved, but also as a grim example of the high stakes and uncontrollable variables that defined early surgical procedures. However, many agree that it's unfair to label Liston as a bad surgeon, even in this case. The assistant had clearly placed his hands in the wrong place if he was in any way at risk of being cut by Liston's knife. The bystander, meanwhile, was also clearly standing too close. While it's often claimed Liston was flourishing his knife, it seems unfair, like blaming a race car driver for hitting people crossing the track. Nonetheless, the incident likely contributed to loads of different myths and stories surrounding Liston. And you can find many videos and articles calling him the worst surgeon in history, when, in fact, it's the opposite that's true. Despite this rather embarrassing mishap, Liston continued practicing surgery, remaining one of the most highly regarded figures in his field. Liston would also invent several life-saving medical devices, such as bulldog forceps, which are used to hold arteries closed during surgery, and a leg splint that's still used today. Even more importantly, his research and dedication to his work left a significant impression on his students, including Joseph Lister, who would go on to pioneer antiseptic techniques that quite literally transformed medicine. Far from history's worst surgeon, Liston's life was filled with dedication to his craft and compassion for his patients. Today, we benefit from medical practices far removed from the brutal era in which Liston practiced. And while modern surgery has evolved in incredible ways, it's astonishing to think that many of these advances trace back to surgeons like him. Nevertheless, it's worth taking a moment to be thankful that you don't live in the days when surgery was fast, bloody work that was just as likely to wreak havoc as save your life. Considering we've been doing it since the very beginning of our species, you'd think a little thing like childbirth would be pretty easy for human beings to pull off. But did you know there was a time not too long ago when nearly 1 in 3 women who gave birth would suffer serious medical side effects? And to make matters worse, that was 1 in 3 women who gave birth in a hospital. Welcome to the 1800s, a time when simply having a baby in a hospital had a higher death rate than flying a World War II bombing mission over Europe. At least until one man showed up to change all that. His name was Ignaz Semmelweis, and his story is a unique mix of tragedy, perseverance, and triumph. Perhaps the most shocking thing about Semmelweis is that the technique he pioneered, the one that saved millions of lives and continues to save more to this day, is one of the most obvious solutions in medical history. The horror of the 1800s. We've already painted a picture of just how risky it was to give birth in the 1800s. However, we haven't painted a complete picture. Obviously, given the time, we can understand that there was a distinct lack of modern medical interventions. There were no epidurals or sonograms or high-tech devices designed to minimize complications for mother and baby. But the real issue was hygiene. In the 1800s, Western cities like New York, London, and Paris had suffered rapid urbanization and were incredibly overcrowded. Plumbing, however, had yet to be invented, so both human and industrial waste was often dumped into rivers, streets, or even directly onto passers-by, depending on which floor you lived on. In short, everything you touched was covered in bacteria. The only problem? Doctors didn't know what bacteria were. At the time, germ theory was in its infancy. Doctors and scientists alike had a very poor understanding of infection control, which meant that any medical procedure was just as likely to make you ill as it was to cure you of whatever ailed you. Surprisingly enough, hygiene was worst in hospitals, a fact that will come into play in a big way later on. Childbirth and hospitals. Hygiene during medical procedures is now fundamental in preventing infections. Even when applying a simple bandage, doctors and nurses will carefully wash and sanitize materials in order to avoid healthcare-associated infections. This is because we understand what germs are and how they work, and we know that any sort of infection can have severe, sometimes deadly, consequences. Medical professionals in the 1800s did not utilize these practices, so where hospitals were supposed to be these beacons of health, they were actually among the most dangerous places you could go. But here's the problem: nobody knew it. To make matters worse, this coincided with another growing trend. You see, for most of history, women gave birth at home, typically with the help of midwives. This was typically due to the fact that medical assistance was usually miles away. But in cities, more and more people lived in cramped apartments, not houses. So when it came time to give birth, it only made sense to head down to the local hospital and let the professionals handle it. Right? Wrong. An absolutely staggering number of women acquired bacterial infections, then known as childbed fever, due to the bacteria that ran rampant in local hospitals. In some cities, maternal mortality rates were as high as 1 in 30 births. Infant mortality was equally devastating due to conditions like neonatal sepsis or birth asphyxia, with up to 20% of babies dying in their first year of life. Tragic? Yes, but people simply didn't know better. Well, most people anyway. Enter Ignaz Semmelweis. Ignaz Semmelweis was born in 1818 in what is now Budapest, Hungary. He grew up decidedly middle class, which gave him a distinct advantage at a time when most people were either filthy rich or dirt poor. Although he initially studied law, Ignaz eventually switched to medicine, attending the prestigious University of Vienna. He earned his doctorate in 1844 and, after failing to become an internist, decided to try obstetrics. Without over-disparaging the medical professionals of the day, many of whom were just doing their best, it's important to understand that most of these men simply lacked knowledge. Others, however, still subscribed to humorism, a belief that imbalances in 4 bodily fluids caused all illnesses. This resulted in treatments like bleeding, isolation, and leeching. When he joined the first obstetrical clinic of the Vienna General Hospital, the first thing Semmelweis noticed was that the death rates in these clinics were shockingly high, especially from childbed fever. But that's not all. He also noticed that the women who gave birth in the literal streets of the city had a lower death rate than those who gave birth in the hospital. Something was wrong. He just needed to figure out what it was. So Ignaz focused his efforts on 2 clinics, one that had an uncommonly higher maternal mortality rate and one where the death rate was uncommonly low. If he could figure out what was or was not happening, the implications would be huge. As it turned out, they were bigger than he could have ever expected. Ignaz's fight against childbed fever. The 2 clinics were almost perfect replicas of one another. They used the same techniques. They saw roughly the same number of patients. The only real difference, minus the mortality rate, was that the more deadly clinic was staffed by medical students, while the clinic with the lower mortality rate was run by midwives. And therein lay the secret. Ignaz observed that medical students often rushed around from task to task. One moment, they would be performing an autopsy. Minutes later, they would be called in to help deliver a baby. The midwives, having no knowledge of autopsies or other medical procedures, only delivered babies. The pieces were just starting to come together when tragedy struck. Semmelweis's colleague, Jacob Kolenchka, died after being pricked by a student's scalpel during an autopsy. Shortly after, he developed a serious illness and died. As terrible as this was, it provided Ignaz with the clue he needed to finish the puzzle. His friend's symptoms had almost perfectly mirrored those of the women who suffered from childbed fever. The conclusion is, physicians were unknowingly spreading the disease from cadavers to their patients. Even without the knowledge provided by modern germ theory, Semmelweis instinctively understood that some form of contamination was occurring. His proposal? Physicians should start washing their hands. Assembling the medical students and physicians at the first clinic, he carefully instructed them to wash their hands with a chlorinated lime solution before examining patients and between any autopsy or other medical procedure. Within a few weeks, the mortality rate at the first clinic dropped from 10% to less than 1%. By the time several months had gone by, the clinic was reporting 0 maternal deaths. Unfortunately, Ignaz's story had another turn to take. Tragic end, revolutionary legacy. Semmelweis may have made a groundbreaking discovery, but medical professionals can be a stubborn lot. His suggestion that doctors' hands could carry deadly infections was met with disbelief and ridicule by the medical community, who were insulted at the very suggestion that they could accidentally be doing harm. At the time, most physicians were from upper-class backgrounds and simply could not accept that they were the reason behind the deaths of so many common women. Despite the overwhelming evidence, politics won the day. Semmelweis was eventually dismissed from his position at the Vienna General Hospital. He returned to Budapest, where he continued to promote hand hygiene as a solution to hospital-acquired infections. However, with no concept of germ theory to back up his assertions, he would have had more luck convincing doctors that their hands were possessed by ghosts. His frustration grew, and he began sending angry letters to prominent physicians, accusing them of being responsible for the deaths of countless mothers. As his behavior became more and more erratic, his friends, colleagues, and even his wife began to worry that he was suffering from a mental illness. Finally, in 1865, Ignaz was committed to a mental asylum, where he died 14 days later. Tragically, it's likely he died after acquiring a bacterial infection. Though he would never live to see it, Ignaz Semmelweis's accomplishments have gone on to save countless lives, and not just mothers. Just a few years after he passed away, Louis Pasteur pioneered germ theory, and Joseph Lister developed his groundbreaking antiseptic techniques. As the years wore on, the evidence that Ignaz had been correct mounted. Eventually, the medical community was forced to accept the importance of hygiene in preventing infections. Today, Semmelweis is considered the pioneer of antiseptic policy, and his legacy lives on in hospitals and medical schools worldwide. Though he died in obscurity, he is now revered as a hero. And to think, all they had to do was wash their hands.
To learn more about that incredible story, click the thumbnail on